Welcome to the Wednesday morning edition of the Gary Sutton Show right here on WSBA. I am Gary Sutton, and great to be with you as it is every day when you get up and you suck it all in as far as the air. You realize you're alive and you move forward, right? And you thank whoever for that day. I thank God every day for the day that I have, and I'm looking forward to having a great morning with you here from 9 to noon on WSBA as we hit a lot of the issues that everybody is talking about around the country, around the state, and around your area right here. And we'll do it all here on the show. The numbers, as always, 1-800-357-0910. You can email me at gary.sutton@cumulus.com. Don't forget that little thing yesterday. Not little at all. We're talking about kind of forming a new group here. People of goodwill who put aside the ideas of right and left and conservative, liberal, not that it's bad to feel a certain way, or Democrat, Republican, before we walk in and start to make good policy. And we're getting that group together, and all you have to do is send to me at gary.sutton@cumulus.com your name and your phone number. I'll put it on the list, and I'll give you a call and let you know through email when we're able to get together. And it's going to just be a kind of a grassroots start, but something to do in terms of people who don't want to use the filters of Democrat, Republican, or sideism, as I call it sometimes. Just kind of figuring out the policies and what's right and what's wrong. And that leads me into our first guest this morning, who has to do that all the time. His name is Matt Brouillette. He's the president and CEO of the Commonwealth Foundation. He is one of the guys in this state that I think does a great job thinking about all these kinds of policies. And the Commonwealth Foundation has become quite a force around the state in terms of putting out their thoughts on policy. And it certainly is an influencer, I think, for a lot of those people who would do that. We welcome Matt to the show. Good morning, Matt. How are you?
Hey, good morning, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you in. And, we talk about policy here, and there are a lot of people who would, first of all, like to see some people doing some policy who are our representatives, both statewide and federally. But, one of the things that we wanted to talk about this morning, and by the way, Matt is in here for a while. Joe Schnetzka, who was here, had an operation yesterday, and I assume that it went well. He had a triple bypass surgery, so we want to have some thoughts thinking about Joe today a little bit, too, and maybe in a moment, if you pray. There you go. But, Matt, good to have you aboard. When we talk about policy in the state of Pennsylvania, one of the things you and I wanted to do in the next couple of weeks here is to really talk about different aspects of policy and looking at it from kind of a common sense and realistic point of view, the here and now, if you will. And one of the things that people are looking at right now is policy with regard to reforming education. And as you look at that right now, what are the things that are on your mind? What are the things that you see that we really have to do to start reforming secondary education and primary education here in the state of Pennsylvania?
Well, Gary, when it comes to policy, it's actually quite simple. If we're asking the right questions and then seeking answers to those questions, I think we can arrive to the right answers and ones that are solutions to solve our problems. The unfortunate thing is that frequently we're not asking the right questions. We end up getting lost in the forest and we can't see the trees because, we've done something for so long and, we just kind of keep doing it and trudging along and tinkering at the edges. But there are some policy issues, in particular as how it relates to how we fund education, that we need some fundamental questions to be answered. Like, what is our objective? It might seem funny, but I don't think we ask that question enough of, who is our customer? Who are we supposed to be serving? To what ends? And then craft our policies with the answers in mind. And we're not asking those questions enough.
It's interesting. I think as I looked at some articles that you had sent me this morning, some other articles that I was reading too, it came down to really two things in terms of education right now in the state of Pennsylvania. Number one, when you look at, for example, the city of Philadelphia and the Philadelphia School District, I mean, you're looking at a public school system there where they said that more than half of Philadelphia voters said their schools deserved a D or an F grade in a poll released last month. Voters in the states reflected that view about their own local school districts, but only after hearing about dismal statewide performance results. And parents in Philadelphia are already deeply dissatisfied with the education of their children for good reason. More than 4 in 5 students in Philadelphia failed to achieve proficiency in both reading and math in 2013, according to the nation's report card. That's one, the education part. How do we make that better? how do we either A, force those public schools to do better, or B, find a better alternative? And then the other part, which I think kind of goes a little bit hand in hand here, is how do we fund? You know, we look back at our funding mechanism here from 1991, and we say, we're not really funding it well here in the state. So how do we do that as we watch the face of public education changing into something far more complex than what it ever was, mostly because people are finding alternatives to what they consider a less than adequate public education?
Well, Gary, let's start with that second question first, because I think that this is the core of it, and then it will drive answers to the first question of what is missing. Well, today we've gotten away from the idea of that, hey, we are funding education for individual children, meaning that we have constructed our public education system, I think everybody would say this, in order to provide an education for every single child in Pennsylvania. Whether they're rich or poor, we have said we want to have a publicly funded system. Well, what we've done is we've really transitioned over time from funding kids to get access to a good education to funding a system and maintaining a system first and foremost in the hopes that it will provide for the kids. Now, that's an important distinction in that we understand what we have done in Harrisburg and even in Washington, D.C., of how we are funding education. We have folks that say, hey, we have to keep the schools open, keep employing adults, irrespective of how many kids we've got in our district. We have some districts that are losing kids just because of population shifts or people moving out of the area, yet we keep funding those schools at the same level. Now, that wouldn't be the case if you were running a department store or a grocery store. Declining customers mean you have to scale back the services that you provide or even the facilities that you keep open. And so we're having this discussion, and we keep thinking about how do we maintain a system rather than saying, how are we going to make sure we educate kids? And that, to me, is the fundamental shift that we have got to make in Washington and in Harrisburg, that we start focusing on getting kids an education rather than maintaining a current system.
You know, it's interesting. We have seen a lot of people go to homeschooling. I mean, I know in your own family, you do homeschooling in your family, and a lot of other people do it as well. And one of the things that they're getting is they're looking at a system also, and this is probably throwing a little extra, monkey wrench into the works, but they're looking at a system and saying, I'm not getting what I want there. In fact, there's a few things I'm getting that I really don't want in terms of maybe a really hardcore secular influx into the education. Is that a fair statement?
Well, absolutely. I think that there are lots of reasons that families are making choices outside of the traditional public school model, whether it is a homeschool choice like we've done for 3 of our kids, or a cyber school option, which we've done for my oldest son. There are all sorts of other alternatives, and I'm in the fortunate group of people that can afford to make those choices. But a lot of parents simply can't, whether it's being able to stay at home or just their zip code challenges that they can't relocate to a better public school district, or you've got restrictions on access to charter schools simply because of a lack of ability to expand current operations. And so this is where we have got to create all sorts of opportunities for parents and for children so it matches their learning needs, because one size fits all doesn't work for kids learning any more than one size fits all shoes works for the entire population. We have to allow, and that's the great thing about technological advances, and I think our understanding of how kids learn, that we can create these opportunities and we can make sure that we are delivering access to education for all kids, irrespective of which system it might be that's delivering it.
We're talking with Matt Brouillette, President and CEO of the Commonwealth Foundation this morning. It's, back to school time. Kids getting all back into school. Most are back into school by now. And, there's a double-edged sword I can see here too, Matt, that I kind of want to throw in as we go through this discussion on education and how to best educate our children here in the state of Pennsylvania. I'm a great believer that, the primary educator of the child is the parent starting out. They're going to give that child a base before they go to school, whether it's, pre-K, whether it's K through 12. They're going to be the primary educator. In the case of you and so many who have decided to go to a cyber school look or to a homeschool look on some of your children, I think that's a great thing. But we also have a double-edged sword there in the sense that there are many families in the state of Pennsylvania, and we see them primarily in the urban districts, not necessarily confined to that, who don't educate their children at home, who count on the school system or whatever to do all that for them. And the school system is not equipped to do that, though they keep on trying. It seems to me that we've kind of wandered off the reservation when it comes to that. How do we attack that problem and approach that problem? Because 16 hours a day they're going to be at home, and the 8 hours a day they're going to be at school. Who do you think has a better chance of winning out if you don't have the kind of atmosphere at home that wants to educate your child as the primary educator?
You are so right, Gary, and we always talk about this, having both been in the classroom, that there's only so much we can do in that classroom if you're not supported at home, or you're getting even contrary efforts that don't enable a kid to get a good education. And so the challenge, I think, for us is to say, all right, we've allowed parents to abdicate a lot of responsibility over the years or decades. We've also allowed the schools to usurp a lot of that responsibility. Which direction should we go? Should we continue to say we want the state, or we want the government, we want the local school district to take this responsibility? Or do we really need to force parents, in a way, to take that responsibility once again? To me, the answer is the latter, Gary. We have got to encourage greater responsibility for parents to take on that primary function, because I'm fearful, Gary, if we keep going the other direction and say, well, parents just don't do it, so therefore we, the state, or we, the taxpayers, have to assume that responsibility. That will be a disastrous outcome for us if we keep going in that direction. So I think it's not an easy choice, but we know what the right choice is, Gary.
One of the things, Matt, as we start to head to a break here slowly, according to the state data, Philadelphia's contributions to the public school employees retirement system increased from, in 2009, $42 million to more than $101 million last year. And we say, and what are we getting for that? 4 out of 5 kids aren't ready to move on. So addressing that pension predicament has got to be confronted and has got to be resolved once and for all, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If we don't, that will bankrupt us, if nothing else does.
And where is the courage to go out and do that? That's the next big question. I also, when we come back, want to head into some more on this public policy talk here on what do we do with public education. And right here in York, we're talking about going to charter schools for York City. Is that the tip of the iceberg for the future? We'll ask Matt Brouillette, President and CEO of the Commonwealth Foundation, when we come right back here on the Gary Sutton Show, the Wednesday morning edition on WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA on a Wednesday morning. Matt Brouillette, President and CEO of the Commonwealth Foundation, talking public policy with us here in the state of Pennsylvania. We're talking about what could be more important than education as our kids start back to school. I was reading a criticism here, Matt, as we head into something local here. York City is looking, for example, at, breaking down the public school system into a number of charter schools here in the city. And I was reading this morning out of Philly.com from about a day ago where this one physics teacher who was from a public school said that the idea is that, there are charter schools in the neighborhood who might compare favorably to some neighborhood schools, but they also don't accept every student and retain the ability to punt the low performers back to the neighborhood public schools. The fact is, this argument is a hasty generalization. If some charters outperform some public schools, it doesn't mean that all charters outperform all public schools. And he said, if you compare the charter schools to the public magnets, for example, they get trashed every single time. And he said, the folks who put forth these arguments time and time again have structured the language in such a way that they can distract from their true agenda. 1, students are a commodity that can and should be monetized. 2, Profit can be maximized by artificially eroding the labor market for educators. And then they point at your group. They say the Commonwealth Foundation uses the phrase free market think tank, quote unquote, to describe themselves. What they really mean is we hate poor people and minorities because they don't generate enough profit yet, quote unquote. Your reaction to that in regards to charter schools?
I could deconstruct a lot of those arguments there, but the reality is, of course, that the current public education system is a $27 billion enterprise. There are a lot of people making good money off of that. All of our arguments are simply saying, hey, we want to make sure kids are getting access to the best education. And we're not defending one system over another.
Right.
And when it comes to charter schools, we absolutely believe there are some that should be shut down. And I think that that's where when parents start making choices with their feet, they will go to where quality is, and they will escape where quality isn't. And that's why you have tens of thousands of kids lining up trying to get into charter schools in the Philadelphia area, despite the demand. The supply isn't there because, the school district is choking it off. And it's simply not true that they can pick and choose. In fact, it's the magnet schools that are the ones that are excluding a lot of kids that would like to do well. So, this really gets back to that first question that we never really answered. What is going to be necessary to drive the continuous quality improvement that our kids need and the taxpayers deserve as well? And this gets to, it ties in with what's happening in York. I don't believe that a monopoly of any service is what's going to provide high quality or hold down costs. And I don't believe whether it's a public monopoly or a private monopoly that you're going to see a whole lot of difference. So I would not be in favor of moving to a privatized monopoly system where you hand over the schools to one particular provider. I want to see all sorts of competition and choice for the parents in the York School District. That way, you incentivize lower costs to taxpayers, and you create greater choices amongst differing providers to make sure that, hey, they are delivering something that parents want. And to me, Gary, those are the principles that they are what drive every other good and service. Right. And yes, education is that same way. And we can try to ignore the laws of economics, but you can't deny them. They're at work today, even in our monopolistic government-run system.
And when you insert competition, whether it's coming from homeschooling, whether it's coming from cyber schooling, whether it's coming from private schooling, parochial schooling, whatever it might be, to the public school system, that tends to push the idea of quality of education, maybe even cost of education down slightly. But by the same token, the one concern that I have is the idea of, where does the uniformity component come in here at the end? For example, if you get a lot of different charter schools in lieu of the public school, what standard do they have to meet at the end? Do we still have a state obligation to have a standard at the end? I know you have standards you have to meet in homeschooling. Your wife does, and you do, in terms of what you teach your children. So is that a problem at all there, or do we just simply have the state kind of being the arbiter here at the end?
Well, I think, Gary, we ought to look at our higher education system. We don't demand every college and university to teach the exact same subjects or have the same curriculum. And we have still recognized as the best higher education system in the world. We can't say that about our K-12 system. In fact, a lot of kids coming from foreign countries are coming from a far better system that has more choices and more competition than what we've got in America. So I would say we can look to some of the good things in higher ed. Yeah, there's some challenges there and some bad things going on. But in general, we have much greater choice and competition in our higher education system that I think we can apply those same principles and learn from them in our K-12 that I think will drive some of the problems that we're seeing right now out of the way and give us the opportunity for tremendous improvement. So
as we both know as teachers, we have to end with a good summary here of our class and what we did today in our 25 minutes together. And it seems to me that, we have a lot of components out there. We got the monetary component, we got the education component, we got the parent component, what kind of atmosphere we're going to put the kids in. How do we draw all those together into a good public policy here in the state of Pennsylvania?
Well, I think we have to answer that question. What is our objective in providing a public education? Is it the education of students or the sustaining of a system that we have come to love and embrace? I think that at the end of the day, we have to come back and say, how are we going to make sure that we educate all of the children who have diverse needs, diverse talents, and create a system that funds kids, not institutions or schools?
And as we remember, an old principal of mine years ago said, remember one thing, the parents are sending you the very best they've got. And it's your job to do the very best you can to educate them. And I think that's the system that we're looking for, to make sure that we as teachers help to go hand in hand with the parents in educating the very best that they're sending us.
Absolutely, Gary. That's all we can ask.
Matt, always a pleasure. We'll look forward to next Wednesday morning. We'll talk about another important public policy issue here in the state of Pennsylvania. Thanks for joining us this morning, Matt.
Thank you, Gary. Take care.
Take care, my friend. Matt Brouillette, CEO and president of the Commonwealth Foundation. When we come back, we're going to check in on your money. Yeah, there are some retirement myths out there from the sales side of the industry, and Ryan Fox, who's the Gettysburg director of the Financial Consulate, is going to be with us to explain what some of those are and have some other thoughts, too, on what retirees are hit with from a sales perspective, all here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. It's 32 minutes past the hour.